Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event this morning. We're going to be hearing from Hania Imran from Pakistan, who is going to tell us about the terrible floods that they've been facing and the climate impacts, and also the cause of climate justice. And FASTA has become more engaged in that directly through our involvement with COP27, which is the upcoming UN climate conference that'll take place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And we're sending a delegation, or at least we're providing our accreditation to a youth delegation of several young people from around the world this time. There's a couple of young people from Ireland, as well as Brazil, India, and Pakistan. And Hania will be a delegate using our accreditation at the COP from FASTA, and we're really pleased that she's able to join us today. She's been very active for several years. She has a climate group called YCAPK that involves over 100 youth focusing on climate justice in Pakistan. And she lives in Islamabad, and she recently participated in a climate court simulation in Austria, which sounds really great. So we're really happy to hear from her, and we'll have a few questions for her afterwards. So I'm just going to hand it right over to Hania. Thanks again.
Hello, everyone. Hello, thank you for the introduction. I'm Hania from Pakistan. I've been a climate activist for the last 5 years. And yeah, so I'm here to talk about the floods that are occurring in Pakistan, and I hope you all can see my screen. Okay, so this is a sad presentation, but there is a little hope at the end because these floods in Pakistan have led me to have many nights where I've just sobbed my eyes out because honestly, they're very devastating. And so at the beginning is really sad, but hopefully you'll have some hope at the end, and maybe you'll know what you can do or how you can help as to these floods and the people that have died and are suffering currently because of these floods. So there's 33 million people that have been affected by the floods in Pakistan, and 33 million people is a lot. That's almost the population of Australia and many other countries. And 1/3 of Pakistan is affected. 1,700 people have died, including many children. And this has been called a monsoon on steroids. And there's, as well as people dying because of the floods, there's many people that are now dying because of diseases that have broken out. And I included some statistics here, but there's malaria, there's dengue, there's diarrhea, etc., that have caused many children and many adults as well to die. They've been living on the road sides of motorways that lead up to different cities, and entire villages, communities, and towns have been wiped away overnight. So some other stories that have come out are a few men that were standing on a rock while the flood had come into their village, and they were standing on a rock that was elevated. And they waited for help for 5 hours and nobody showed up to help them, and so they also were submerged and they died. And many schools, many health facilities have been destroyed, as well as the fact that there's pregnant women and little children, that some of the videos and the journalists and the people that are going into these areas that I've talked to, or the videos or pictures that I've seen, which I have not included in this, is because they're extremely horrific. It looks like an apocalypse in action. So those are some of the facts of what is going on in Pakistan right now. So here's a before and after picture in Rajanpur, Pakistan. So the before, you can see that, it's a completely normal city. And then the after is it's just completely submerged. And this is the before and after for many areas across Pakistan. So this is a video of a man who lost his banana farm in Pakistan that I wanted to share.
This farmer in Pakistan lost his entire crop to the floods. Almost all of the 21-acre farm is underwater, and none of the crop is salvageable, according to the owner, Mohammed Yunus.
अभी हमारे 21 सिटी में खेला था, इसके अलावा जैसे बारह को हमारा नुकसान हुआ था, हमारा पूरे का नुकसान हुआ था। अभी यहाँ पे कोई खेला होने का लायक नहीं है, धूप बना हमारे लगाना पड़ते।
The farm outside of Tata, Pakistan, is an example of how the devastating flooding, which was exacerbated by the human-caused climate crisis, is affecting people. Not only will Yunus lose his harvest's yield, around $2,951, but all of his farmhands and helpers will also be out of work. The heavy rains in the monsoon season in Pakistan put a third of the country underwater, causing 1,400 deaths and more than $30 billion in damages.
Okay, so that is just, this video is a little old now. The damages that they're estimating are around $40 billion US dollars. So yeah, why is this happening? I included some pictures of world leaders and also the Pakistani prime minister, current Pakistani prime minister, and one of the previous Pakistani prime ministers who's shaking hands with Modi. I believe that these are the people that are responsible for this crisis. And yeah, I mean, it was their responsibility to, curtail this. And I do know that we're looking at the future right now to solve this issue, and that we're aiming for, 2-degree warming. But right now, at a 1.1 degree warming as well, like this is what's happening to my country. So I don't think even that goal is enough, because many countries will suffer before we even get to the point where of what we think is okay. It's really not, because this is the end of the world for so many people already. So yeah, the scientific reasons are that Pakistan on the starting of this year experienced record-breaking heat waves. One of the hottest cities on earth is located in Pakistan, which is called Jacobabad. And their temperatures went up to 50 degrees Celsius, which is 122 Fahrenheit. Yeah, so people over there have a saying. They say that if we went to hell, we would take a blanket with us because it's so hot. And then Pakistan is ranked as one of the most, like the top 10 most countries affected by the climate crisis, even though Pakistan does not contribute to the climate crisis, one of the lowest carbon emitters in the world. And then also Pakistan has the most glaciers outside of the polar region, which is why, when it starts heating up, glaciers melt, and then we have glacial lake outbursts where many bridges, hotels were also destroyed, and they cause flooding. And other than that, of course, world leaders and governments are to blame, but our own government, there's bad governance. They're busy with their own petty politics. There's bad urban and rural planning, illegal construction, political instability, corruption, and much more, which have caused the floods to be exacerbated. So yeah, what do we do now? This is one of the protests that we held recently on 23rd September, which was focused on the floods in Pakistan. We had people that were affected by the floods and people from marginalized communities come in and give speeches, as well as us activists. We also shared poems and things like that. And so here are a few pictures from that protest. So the program in Austria that Mike was mentioning, we made an awareness wall, and all of this was happening while I was in Austria. So, I urged them to highlight what was happening in Pakistan. And so at the Ars Electronica Festival this year, I don't know if any of you know what that is, but essentially it's a festival where many people come from around the world and showcase their art. And so we made an awareness wall where we focused on Pakistan and also some other areas that were being affected by climate change. So what do I hope to achieve at COP27? This is the first time I'm going to the conference of the parties, and I want to be able to advocate for loss and damage finance, climate reparations, and bring attention to the climate mass murder that is occurring in Pakistan right now. Other than that, I want to emphasize on issues related to women and children and other marginalized communities and how they correlate with the climate crisis. Although I know that many people have been already working on this and advocating for these things, I want to focus on specifically Pakistan because, currently I don't think that there's enough media attention or enough attention anywhere on what's happening in Pakistan. Because, the media focuses on one thing and then moves on to the next. And yeah, I mean, they did focus on Pakistan for a while, but now that is dying down again, even though the situation is just as bad, if not worse. So what can you do? These are a few things that came to my mind as to how you can contribute or how you can help. The first thing is that there's a lot of people affected. 33 million people is just a number until you put it into context. If you can donate to organizations on the front lines of this crisis, there's many organizations that I will list at the end. Advocate wherever you can. Talk about it to your colleagues or friends or family or on your social media accounts. Hold your governments accountable for this crisis. There's protests going on around you, and if they aren't, organized and hold fundraisers. Research more about what is happening. Even though I've provided a summary, there are many stories that are coming out, and other ways that you can help amplify voices that are being silenced or ignored. There's many ways to do this. So this is my organization. It's called Youth Climate Activist Pakistan, YCAPK on Instagram if you want to follow it. Here are some protests that we've held, some pictures from some protests we've held. So essentially what we do is we organize, mobilize, and have tough conversations around the climate crisis in Pakistan. So we bring about youth from different areas in Pakistan that may not have been involved in climate activism or activism in general otherwise, and sort of involve them in organizing and in the ways that they can help, especially privileged youth, because of course there's so many people that are affected by climate change that they really can't do this kind of work because they're just looking for their next meal, or they're just hoping to survive. And so it is our job as people that are in Pakistan, especially that are not as affected, to do something about it, to hold our own government accountable as well. So these are some of the organizations that you can donate to. I've added the links. There's many more, but these are some of the more trusted ones, because of course, when something like this happens, there's people that want to just make money, and so you have to really look out for where you're donating to. And these are the sources. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Hania. It's very sobering and especially difficult for people in the global north that we have a major responsibility, historical responsibility on these, and it's something we need to face the reality of, and appreciate you presenting that. Just a question about how you got involved, because youth climate justice activism actually is a sign of hope. Like you said, you wanted to end on a note of hope, and for us, of course, we have to be active as not youth anymore, but we are hoping that the youth will be more and more engaged, and it sounds like you are. And how did you first get involved in the climate justice movement?
So I was in 8th grade, or yeah, it was 8th grade. I watched a documentary because Leonardo DiCaprio was in it, and it's called Before the Flood or Before the Floods. I'm not sure, but anyways, I watched it, and I was very moved by it, and so I decided to just plant trees on my 14th birthday that was coming up. And of course, now we know that individual action is not going to help solve this crisis, but at the time, I believe that individual action was what was required. And so, over the years, I started getting more and more involved. Wrote letters to the Minister for Climate Change, and then, maybe had some events at my school to make people aware of the issue. And yeah, then I just didn't really stop because, yeah, it was a major issue that was affecting people in Pakistan.
Thanks. That's great. And regarding the climate movement in Pakistan, and you live in the capital, and you said you're pretty close to Parliament, so you see a lot of protests. Is climate change part of the conversation there? Or I know in the United States for many years and decades even, the climate movement would talk amongst ourselves about it, but you just didn't hear about it as much in public. And maybe that's starting to change a little bit. But I was wondering how do you see the climate movement in Pakistan, and what are your ideas for how it can move forward?
So the climate movement in Pakistan is, in the traditional sense, very small. Of course, there's people that are indigenous people that, of course, have fought for their land and, forests and etc. for very, very long. But the youth climate movement in particular has just recently emerged, and it's slowly building up. We don't see the prime minister even, or the ministers that he has, or people that are in the National Assembly, which is essentially the government of Pakistan or our representatives that go from different cities to represent us after we vote for them, they don't talk about climate change as they should. Even if a flood does come or happen, for the first thing that we think is, oh, it's just a natural disaster and that has nothing to do with climate change. And yeah, and the media is really bad at reporting on it as well. They don't call it climate change. They just say, oh, floods happened or this has happened. And so the climate movement or the youth climate movement in Pakistan has recently seen more activity in the previous 4 to 5 years. And yeah, I mean, we're still working on it. Of course, it's we do try to put pressure on the government, and we do protest and ask them to speak on these issues or work on policies on these issues, or etc., etc. But it's just that the governments, there's a lot of political instability. So there's one government comes, and it's just recently that the previous government actually spoke about climate change as an issue. The prime minister for the first time spoke about it, and so now they have to acknowledge the fact that climate change is an issue. We do have a ministry for climate change, but again, they aren't doing as much as they should, and they're more focused on their own politics than they are on actual issues. So yeah.
Thank you.
What's your sort of key hope or goal for the COP for yourself personally? What would you like to get out of it if you can?
I don't know. So I this is the first time that I'm going, and I already feel overwhelmed with like information and all of the stuff that's gonna be going on there, and I haven't even gone there. It hasn't even started. So so I don't know what I hope to achieve with myself personally. I just hope maybe I can connect with other activists and learn from other people as well as to what they've been doing or what their fight has been like, and maybe hopefully apply some of that stuff to my organization and the youth movement we have here in Pakistan. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, why don't we switch to our second speaker, which will be Caroline from Feasta. She has written this paper, which is related to what Feasta's proposed solution to climate change would be. We call it Cap Global Carbon. She'll tell you more about it. And we're hoping to do a release around this in the lead up to COP27, and also working with some other NGO partners such as World Basic Income. And so Caroline, take it away.
Sure, thanks, Mike. So a lot of familiar faces here, but not everybody's familiar face. So I will go ahead and talk about this a little bit to explain it to people who haven't heard of it before. Essentially, we're in Feasta, we're really concerned both with the need to eliminate fossil fuel use and emissions and for climate justice. To us, those two things are equally important. So we're really looking at ways to, as Hania says, to hold governments accountable, oblige them to do this, both of these things, to phase out fossil fuels and to help to support climate justice. So we have an idea about this, a kind of structure that we've worked on for a few years, and we've evolved a bit over the years. But just before I get onto that, I'll just briefly talk about inequality as well, because as we all know, there's just incredible levels of inequality in terms of the emissions that are generated in the world. At the moment, globally, you've got the richest 10% emitting about 50% of emissions, and it's just incredibly uneven. And it's also very unevenly spread between countries and then within countries as well. And then we have the situation also where we've got a lot of bickering and wrangling and countries not agreeing and so on, and world leaders not being able to actually act, as Hania was saying as well, or being able to but not doing it. So there are all these issues, and the UN process, which is based on consensus, tends not to get very far because everything gets watered down. So our idea as a way of addressing this is to look at the system that we're calling cap and share, and Cap Global Carbon is kind of a global version of the same system. Cap and share is kind of the framework underneath it. And the idea with cap and share is that you look at where are the emissions coming from. Well, about 80 or 85% of them come from fossil fuel. So why don't we look at fossil fuel and look at actually the source of the fossil fuel, where it's coming out of the ground, where it's being extracted, and also where it's being imported into countries. If you look on the left here, you've got various sources of fossil fuel. You've got coal and oil and gas. And so we're saying that companies which produce these things need to be obliged to buy permits to do that. And the number of permits will go down every year, so that there will be less and less available being produced. There's a hard limit on how much they can produce year by year. And then in order to get the permits, they have to buy them. And then the money that's raised from buying that, well, that kind of naturally belongs to everybody, because it represents the use that's being made of the atmosphere that we want to stop over time. But it represents the atmosphere as a commons, as something that's everybody's responsibility and everybody's right as well. So if that money was then recycled and given back to people per capita, then those who use less emissions than the average would automatically end up with more money, and those who use more would automatically be paying those who use less. And if you think of that on a national level, it's already interesting. But if you think of it on an international level, it gets very interesting, because in fact, what would really happen is that the richer countries would be systematically transferring a lot of money to the poorer countries to help them with climate action. And this ties in with the wider cash transfers movement, which a lot of people in the global south are aware of. A lot of development charities, but also governments, for the past 20 years or so, have been working on the system of distributing transfers to people in the form of cash. And it can have a really good effect. And if it's well done, it depends on how well it's managed. But if it's well done, it can have a very good effect in terms of gender rights, in terms of education provision. And people tend to use the money very wisely. They tend to invest it in things that will last, that will help them in the future, like education. It can also be used for things like community renewable energy, all kinds of things. So it can help with the energy transition as well. And at the moment, we have a small group of countries called the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. It's a new alliance that started last year. And essentially these countries, they're mostly all global north countries. It's just Costa Rica in the global south, but they've all promised that they're going to phase out their production of oil and gas in line with the Paris Agreement. So that's a good step towards phasing out fossil fuel, which is what I first talked about, phasing it out at the mine or the wellhead. However, obviously there's a lot of things. It's only, for one thing, it's only a small group of countries. And for another thing, there's various things missing. It needs to include coal. It needs to include imports of fossil fuel to the countries, because at the moment it only includes the countries themselves production. And there's lots of ways it could be expanded. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that now, but we think it's really, really important that it be expanded to include global south partners, and that there's structural support included to support climate justice in what they're doing. So in other words, as well as eliminating the fossil fuel, they need to think about finance and justice as well. So I'm going to click through these very fast, because I've written a paper about this, and I can put the link in the chat after. But the idea is that this BOGA, this alliance, it could firstly expand, it could join in with the EU. The thing about that, though, is the EU's population is producing more than its fair share of emissions globally. So we want to make sure this is a system that balances out, where the countries involved everybody in them is getting a fair share of compensation for the use of the emissions. Then you see what you could do is you could expand it so that it includes a lot more countries, and so that you've got a balance in terms of both population and emissions. And here I brought in a few different countries like Brazil, which is very important, the Southern American countries, and so on. And you could then expand further. I mean, you don't even have to do it all in this order. You could do it in different ways, but you could expand it so it includes a lot of the so-called least developed countries, like sub-Saharan African countries that have very low emissions, and North America. And just in relation even to that, we haven't brought in China and India, any of the really big countries, but if we're just looking even at these countries, where it's already talking about a lot of money being generated that would go to low-income people. And and it might seem like, oh, that's not realistic politically, but it's actually less than it's being spent on the military in the US at the moment by quite a long way. So the money's there. It just needs to be put in the right place. Then if you bring in China and India, then you're really getting to a high proportion of the world's population. I don't want to go into detail, but the two graphs on the left, the one on the far left there shows how much population we're talking about compared to the world population. And the one next to it shows how many emissions per capita they are using compared to the world. So if you bring that in, then you're getting to where you're really covering a lot of the emissions in the world. And then what I did for this talk is that I also added in Pakistan because I hadn't put Pakistan in, which was no intention. It was just that I had to pick countries kind of out of the odds. And so I hadn't included Pakistan in the original paper. But I included Pakistan, Australia, and South Korea, and the United Arab Emirates, which is a long shot because it's a big oil state, but still I just put it in. And those 4 countries, they all balance each other out in terms of emissions. If you put all of their emissions together, you get roughly the global average. So they could all be a partnership or join in together. This is an interesting thing to combine with the idea of climate courts, because this could be something that could be required as part of a legal action resulting from a climate court, for example. So just very briefly about Pakistan. So you've got 221 million people and a very, very low average greenhouse gas emissions per capita compared to the world, which just shows how incredibly unjust this whole thing is at the moment. It's just amazing. You know, it's like a quarter of the world's average. And at the moment, if we had a system like what I'm just talking about, then the transfers, the money that would flow to Pakistan from other countries would be roughly 79 billion per year. It wouldn't go on forever because we'd be phasing out fossil fuels, but it would be for a good while. And say if, for example, this was given out as cash transfers, that means that 50% of the population on average, they get like over 50% more money per year, which it's modest, but it's something. You know, all of these things are a help. That's just one way of thinking about it. Or another way of thinking about it, I'm just alluding now to what Hania said about the need for 50 billion in reparations at least from flood damage. Then there's also money that's needed for climate finance, like for the energy transition. The UNDP says Pakistan needs at least 101 billion by 2030 and another 65 billion by 2040. But if you add all of that together, it seems like, oh, that's a lot. But then if you think, you know, a system like this, you'd be systematically getting roughly 80 billion, 79 billion in every year. Over time, you would actually be covering that, and you would have more as well, which we need, I think. So I think it could be a significant support for all of those things. So just finally, just in terms of the way that climate is often talked about, a lot of times people just ask for more action, or they ask for very piecemeal specific things to be done. And we need everything. We need all of these things. You know, we need things like divestment and so on, and donations to charities working on the ground and so on. But we also need something systemic, I think, that will really nip this problem in the bud and look at the production end and also at the justice end together. So that's the whole point of this project that we're working on now. So I'll put a link to the paper in the chat. And if there are any questions, please let me know. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm really glad to see the stepping stones from where BOGA is. And BOGA started out as a press conference at COP26 with Denmark and Costa Rica. And they had several other countries part of it. But to see how we could make that into kind of a hopeful press conference and a sort of a statement from a few countries into a global system that would mirror what our idea around cap global carbon would be, this sort of provides a roadmap. And I haven't seen that anywhere else. So I think that's something FASTA can really contribute to the conversation. And we are hoping some of our youth delegates will bring that to COP27. So thank you also, Hania, for your presentation. Very enlightening, very sobering, but hopefully a call to action. And so we all wish you good luck at COP27 and safe travels. And then for the rest of us, let's post on our website those links to the organizations that Hania recommended, and we'll send something like that out to our membership. And then also, I'd just like to encourage, you know, hopefully more interest and involvement around cap global carbon, because the more people hear about it, it takes sometimes a couple times. We've talked to people about it, and then 6 months later they said, hey, now I get it. So we just got to keep at it and do it, you know, one step at a time. But I think with that, I think we can end this recording. Thank you all for attending.